Good evening, everyone. It's great to have you all present. My name is David Henriksen, and I serve as director of the Institute for Leadership and Service at Valparaiso University. It's my great privilege to host our Pathways to Purpose lecture series, which is designed to spark conversations about the virtues and vocations that make for lives worth living. Before I turn things over to our speaker, let me briefly sketch out our agenda for tonight. After my introduction, we'll have about half an hour for the main talk, then about 15 to 20 minutes in which I'd invite you all to participate via a Q&A. We'll be using the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom window, so please feel free to post a comment or question there along with your name and where you're coming from. Tonight, we aren't able to have our guest physically present, although I would love to bring him back to Valparaiso at some point in the future. But even virtually, it's a great pleasure for me to introduce the artist and author Makoto Fujimura. Fujimura's biography is too replete with honors to really do it justice. He is an award-winning artist whose deliberate, refractive, slow art has been described by David Brooks of the New York Times as a small rebellion against the quickening of time. His art has been featured widely in galleries and museums around the world, in notable collections including the Museum of Contemporary Art in Tokyo and the Huntington Library. And from 2003 to 2009, he was a presidential appointee to the National Council on the Arts. Among his earlier books are the works Culture Care and one of my favorites, Silence in Beauty, Hidden Faith Born of Suffering. The British poet Edward Thomas once wrote an exquisite little poem in which he described a simple towering plume of smoke rising from a train as so fair it touched the roar with silence. And in my own encounters with the work of Makoto Fujimura, I've been overwhelmed by a silence so deep it roars and arrests the gaze of anybody who pays it attention. But this is what beauty does. It holds a fragile power to generate meaning and recognition. It resists commodification and crass pragmatism and invites those who behold it to stop and linger a while. Reading Fujimura's new book, Art and Faith, I was reminded often of the story in the Gospels about the woman who came to Jesus with an alabaster jar and poured expensive perfume on his feet. What the woman at Bethany did made no economic or earthly sense. It was an excessive act with no instrumental value, but she saw Jesus as her beloved and knew that he was worth the offering. She took the perfume, which was itself a limited, finite good, and made it something of infinite value. As the art and writing of Fujimura suggest, these sorts of acts ought to arrest our attention so that we can model their beauty in our own lives and our callings. So Mako, welcome to Valparaiso University. Even if it is virtual, we're glad to have you.
Cup was broken, alabaster jar was broken, and Mary took that nod upon feet of Jesus. It's a reflection that I have been doing on past 15 years of Lenten season. I go through Mark 14, John 11 and 12, reflect on the passage of Mary pouring that expensive nard that Davy spoke of. And the critical passage that I focus on is the shortest sentence in the entire Bible, 2 words, Jesus wept. And I often have said that these 2 words capture for me everything that you need to know about this God, everything you need to know about Jesus, everything you need to know about how we are to respond to God's love. And I make the case in my book, Art and Faith, Theology of Making, that through those 2 words, if you can journey into through this pinhole and journey into an image of the world that is projected upside down, as the case of pinhole cameras, if you ever played with one. The image is turned upside down, and the narrower the focus of the pinhole, the sharper the image. So in an ambitious project of any type, but especially if I am to do a immense work for exhibit or for project, such as the pieces that sit behind me called Walking on Water. These monumental paintings that I've been working on since 3/11, March 11, 2011 tsunami, Great Tohoku earthquake and tsunami that happened exactly 10 years ago. Japan still have not recovered. The nuclear meltdown still continues, and this this is a still to this day a critical situation in Japan. Not many people know about that, but 10 years since that day when everything was washed away in Tohoku, northern area of Japan, fishing villages that stood for hundreds of years. I visited in the April, about 3 weeks after this horrific scene. And I arrived, and one of my friends who took me there took me to an elementary school, which is up the hill. And many children were saved that day because they were at the school and teachers guided them to escape up the hill even further. And when I arrived at the school, there was a fishing boat turned upside down on top of the school, and inside were many orphaned children because the tsunami washed away entire generations of people in the villages. So grandmothers, grandfathers, fathers, mothers, they were all gone in a single moment. So faced with this tragedy, and for me as an artist, I always like to say that my role as an artist is to ask questions and to deepen the search of our hearts toward asking deeper questions, and they don't necessarily give answers. But I began on these monumental size paintings after I came back, and wanting to ask these questions. Can we walk on water in such a time as this? And so Walking on Water series still continues, as you can see behind me. These are new paintings that I did this summer. But during the pandemic, it became, it carried another layer of force, and this sense of longing and loss that our time in 2020 and 2021 has brought to us very uniquely and universally. And I have said that there's no one alive today that has not been touched by this pandemic. So it is a universal reality, which means that another way to look at it is that we are connected with every single person on this earth who are going through this time. And as frustrating and as trying as a shutdown has been, I still go back to 3/11, 2011, and then 9/11, 2001. We commemorate the 10th anniversary of 3/11, and then we are going to be commemorating the 20th anniversary of 9/11. I was right there where the towers fell, underneath, trapped in the subway. My children were going to schools 2 blocks away from the towers. They grew up as ground zero children. And so even in that trauma, I witnessed firsthand and lived through it as a survivor, um, reflecting on that day, and then 3/11 reflecting on that day. I am haunted by these questions that keep enlarging itself, standing in front of, faced with ground zero conditions of our lives. And then during the pandemic, I had obviously plenty of time to reflect on that. And here in my studio in Princeton, I continue to work on these paintings. The bigger the project, the more ambitious the project, the narrower the focus ought to be, I tell young artists. So I was daunted by many of these themes. So I chose the shortest passage in the entire Bible to focus on and to see the images of these traumatic images and create something new out of them through the pinhole of John 11:35. So let me just recount the story a little bit, and I will share from the main thesis of the book. And Art Plus Faith book is also focused around the pinhole of Jesus Wept. And why these 2 words, as I said, can capture the entire Gospels, and really entire Scripture, from creation to new creation. How could that be? So John 11 takes place in Bethany. Bethany is where Mary, Martha, and Lazarus lived and hosted Jesus many times. It's in the Palestinian side of the divide, so today it would be very difficult to get there. But I stood on the edge of Jerusalem, looking out toward Bethany, thinking about this scene, where, as some of you may recall, Jesus was hosted by this family. They are one of the closest families that he had on this side of eternity. And Martha is kind of the CEO of the family. She is initially in Luke. She is the one that is busily running around taking care of things, and she finds her sister, who is at the feet of Jesus listening to him. And she tells, Martha tells Jesus that do something about this, because I need my sister to help me to prepare for this party that we are throwing you, to host you. And yeah, Jesus says, Mary has chosen the right thing, to listen, to be still. And in John 11, you see a different Martha, a Martha that's perhaps has gone through the maturity process that one does with Jesus. And she and Mary are struggling because of Lazarus being sick, ill, and he's not doing well. So they send a messenger to Jesus, telling the Lord that he needs to come and heal Lazarus. They're, I'm sure, quite convinced that Jesus will respond and come. But in the beginning of chapter 11 of John, you see that Jesus tells the disciples that he's intentionally delaying his coming. And for the glory of God. The disciples have no idea what he's talking about. And yet, by the time he arrives in Bethany, Lazarus has been dead for 4 days. So Martha comes, being the active, action-oriented person that she is, meets him halfway. hears Jesus is coming, so she goes straight to meet with the Lord. And Martha asks him a very logical, analytical question. Lord, only if you had been here, my brother would not have died. And Jesus gives a pretty much a summary of the gospel right there. And he asks her, I am the resurrection and life. Martha, do you believe this? And Martha says, yes, I do believe that the resurrection will happen. She doesn't fully comprehend what Jesus means, but she's processing this analytically. And she also knows upon meeting her Lord that this is something that merits her sister to hear, and yet she is not there. So she goes back and fetches Mary, who is behind in her community, weeping and rather angry. I can imagine her emotions as she is waiting for Jesus to arrive, and knowing that he did not come when she asked him. She was hurt, deeply troubled, and so Martha comes and says, the rabbi is looking for you, and she goes obediently to Jesus. And yet I can see upon the meeting of these two friends, Jesus and Mary, this would have been a very intense moment. Mary says, Lord, if only you had been here, my brother would not have died. Same words, two sisters, like twins. Exact same words were spoken at that time, but I suspect with different emotion. Mary's comment would have been very much filled with emotion, as opposed to Martha's, who seemed to be more analytical, and she likes to process things intellectually. And so for Martha, Jesus gave this full explanation, as it were, of what is going to happen, what he did to come to this point, and that he will be the one that will bring resurrection into this, insinuating that Martha will see that firsthand. But yet, when Mary is in front of Jesus, he doesn't say a word. And seeing her face and seeing her tears, he weeps. So Jesus wept. Jesus wept on 9/11. Jesus wept in 3/11. Jesus weeps for all of us who are suffering, going through this time of pandemic, horrific divides and polarization in this country. Jesus weeps to viscerally in this day and this moment for you and me. And you have to ask why. Why did he weep? Why did he wasted time not being able to somehow carry what he purposefully said to the disciples that he was going to do? He stood there with Mary and he wept. When all he had to do, right, was to take her by her hand, bring her to the grave, resurrect Lazarus, and and tell Mary, you have little faith. Why didn't you believe me? I told you that I am the resurrection and life. He doesn't say that. He stood silent on the hill of Bethany. The word of God stood silent on the hill of Bethany and wept. And to me, as I said earlier, these two words signify everything. And I backtrace the logic of this back to creation in this book. I start with the theological notion of aseity, which means that God stands outside of time and space and is all sufficient. God has no need. So why did God create the universe? God doesn't need the universe. God doesn't need any of us. That's a shocking statement to make, and yet that's what Genesis is framing as the beginning of creation. God stood outside of time and space, and in the beginning, God created. And that aseity of God, the reality that God is all sufficient, God does not need us, God does not need a creation, and yet God created. God created because God is love. And love will always create generatively into the world. And love will transcend efficiency and need that we may have ourselves. So God's creation is different from ours. I will often create out of a need, but God doesn't do that. So God is the perfect artist. God is the artist. I could make a claim that God is the only artist, true artist, who can create something out of nothing, ex nihilo creation, which we do not have the capacity to do. And yet, God enters the world through Jesus. God sends his son out of this love, out of the exuberance of creation, but God sends the best part of what God, the essence, embodied in a human body. And God creates this utter dependency on the fallen world and fallen creatures, us, because Jesus came as a babe in a manger. And a baby, as we all know, is very vulnerable, is utterly dependent on the mother and parents and community around that child. And the baby cannot do anything. It's the complete reversal of God's aseity, is the son's dependency on human fallen creatures. That is a staggering gap that I just stated. And this reality of Jesus coming as a fully human, fully God, presence in a fallen universe and fallen world is this reality that artists have always tried to understand and stand in that gap, at least, if not try to reconcile them. But it is a way that poets and artists of throughout history, whether they're conscious or not, in other words, you don't have to be a Christian to understand this enormous gap between the creation and the created, this gap that exists between transcendence and immanence. There's a reality that all artists are intuitively connected to, and that's why I can paint faced with ground zero. That's why I can paint these images of walking on water, because I am asking these deeper questions that can we walk on water? I may not have the answers, but I am trying to frame that gap into a single question. And when I encountered John 11:35, Jesus wept. That is a pinhole that allows me to see the projection of God's universe as upside down as it seems, to be in front of me in tight focus. And what Jesus' tears can mean to us today is this. During the shutdown, so many times when we were at the end of our ropes, so many ways that we have been frustrated. Many of us may have lost loved ones. Many of us know somebody who have been through literally hell and back. Many of us have seen the fractures in this nation, no matter which side of the aisle you stand on. And in that place, in the gaps that this world presents itself, in the cracks and the fissures that is literally running through the ground that we are standing on. Jesus weeps in those places and those times and those moments as well. God's presence is more important sometimes than answers, rational answers. We need rational answers, but God's presence in suffering is far more valuable when we think about the moments in our lives when we were given life again or afresh, rejuvenated, when we felt the presence of the divine in our lives. And so walking on water is something I pretend, but I actually believe it. I am painting with tears of Christ. These are pulverized minerals such as azurite. Here is a azurite rock that gets pulverized by hand by Japanese artisans. And I mix them here with Japanese hide glue. So they are handmade paint. And then I am painting these outside and then painting with water-based technique called Nihonga. So I'm literally walking on water as I paint these. And I pretend that I am painting with Christ's tears because I want my expression to be tied completely with John 11:35. And I talk about in the book what happens to Lazarus, what happens to Mary afterwards, what happens to Martha. But we probably don't have time to go into that today. Why create? A lot of times art seems rather useless in such a troubled time as ours. But if you talk to the survivors of the Holocaust, they can tell us today definitively that the reason why they survived was not just because they had bread, but because they had theater, they had poetry, they had music, they had humor. These are things that are intangibles. You cannot even in that sense, you can't commoditize them and create into efficient utilitarian commodities. That's precisely why we need the arts. We need, in a time when it is hard pressed, or time when we recall as moments of moments when the presence of ourselves and those around us become real to us. When the world becomes full of burning bushes, when we understand that there is something more to existence than our survival, that's when, paradoxically, when we can survive beyond the trauma. So the arts taps into this, and then what the artists are doing is to lay aside the efficient pragmatism that we have come so used to, this resume building that we do all the time to justify our existence. And they could move into a zone of existence that is more than utilitarian pragmatism. So when people say, well, art, what, how does it, matter in a time like this? Well, I say to them that it's essential because it's useless. Jesus stood on the hills of Bethany and wept for no reason other than to be present in Mary's suffering. He had the keys, he had the answer, but he did not. He waited, and he made sure that she understood that he suffers too, that he is not just a miracle worker who can fix the problem and move us beyond death, but he's going to have to go through the cross of suffering. And for him to be present with people, with his tears, was the first step that he would take toward Jerusalem. So the cup was broken and mended. This is a kintsugi bowl that was done by my friend Esther Moon. This venerable Japanese traditional kintsugi will mend the fractured bowl with Japan lacquer. But instead of hiding it, making it look like it never happened, it highlights the gold. And what Esther did as a designer was not just mend the cracked areas, but added this little squiggle here as a little delightful design. The kintsugi bowl is far more valuable than the original, as valuable as original tea bowls, teawares in Japan could be. And that's the picture of new creation, is that God chooses not to turn us back into perfected state in Eden. God chooses through creation and fall and the fissures and ground zero experiences and tsunamis and earthquakes and pandemics. God chooses for us to make ourselves avail to this reality of kintsugi, that God will much rather pour gold into the cracks, into the fissures. And that's why Jesus appears in post-resurrection appearances with his nail marks still there. Thomas tells his friends that I'm not going to believe until I touch the wounds of Christ. And Jesus shows up and invites Thomas to touch them, but Thomas doesn't. He kneels down and worships, my Lord, my God. He is the first recorded male disciple to do so. He understood what Mary understood, that when Jesus is present with his wounds and his tears, that reality of his presence is far more important, actually, than the proof. That presence of this Savior will carry us not just to be mended, but mended in a new creation that still bears the old mark of the wounds of our time, the struggles that we go through in this life. And then that is turned into some beautiful design that we don't understand today. Only by faith we can create, and only by faith we can walk on water. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Mako. So that concludes the formal part of our evening together, but we have time now for Q&A. So as I mentioned at the beginning, down at the bottom of your Zoom window, you should see a window for questions and answers. So I'm going to open the floor up now. Feel free to jot down some notes and submit them, and then I can pose those to Mako. While people are coming up with their questions and submitting them, I thought I'll take the privilege of posing the first one to you, Mako. And I was wondering if you could reflect a little bit on the question of whether there could ever be a happy artist, because the way you describe the relationship between suffering and pain and loss and the way that's transformed into beauty and meaning in art. I wonder, could you ever have somebody who didn't suffer and still produce something beautiful in the way that you describe it?
Well, I'm a pretty happy artist. Happiness is maybe it's not the sentimental happiness, but happiness that is in the Beatitudes. Blessed are those who mourn. I am, going through my ground zero experiences and traumas. I've come out on the other end, having more sense of belonging and faith than I have before, and I realized what I had before was real, and it's not it wasn't fake, but this blessed assurance is something that I think you can only understand truly on the suffering, and then re-engaging yourself into the practice of faith. And I don't mean going to church, I although that may help, but it really is listening to the Spirit's voice, and then following the path, following the shepherd, good shepherd. I get lost often, so good shepherd comes to get me, as he promised. He is faithful. And so as far as art is concerned, I really do think that it is for human thriving, and therefore great art. The most important part of art is love, as Vincent van Gogh repeatedly stated. Greatest art is loving people. And so in that sense, all of us are artists, and in that we can gain happiness by giving ourselves away, and being able to love people through whatever we're doing. Being an artist is a distinct privilege of being able to see the vista of God's domain of new creation clearly. I spend time in my studio here, and it is the most sacred experience of being in touch with the Spirit, the God's presence. Even at my darkest times, were so real to me that I can say for sure that is what kept me, not only what kept me going, but what kept me asking the question deeper and deeper, and wanting to know, not necessary answers, but deepening longings that I have for the blessed assurance.
So you have a studio as a sacred space.
Yeah.
For those of us who don't have that, and certainly don't have even a tenth of the degree of your artistic expertise, where can we find those sacred spaces? Where can we find the places where beauty can meet us? And
yeah, It's a great question. I think we can, whether it be a kitchen or whether it be gardening or whether it be a table. You know, Emily Dickinson's 17 and a half inch by 17 and a half inch cherry wood desk, yeah, upstairs in her Amherst house. That's all she had to create. And that's all she needed to change the world. I always ask artists, do you have your 17 and a half inch square table? Now that table needs to be dedicated to your art, poems, your dreams. Don't put bills on there, something that you need to do, but this is a gratuitous space where you can create and imagine and train your imagination to be sanctified. And then of course practice your craft. But you don't need much. In fact, I was told by a novelist when I was in college and when I was in undergrad that if you spend 2 hours a week, 2 hours on Saturday writing, you will finish a novel in 2 years. I since practiced this. I'm an author of 4 books, so I think he was right.
I could use that advice right now.
No.
All right, we have a couple questions coming in now. One is from Gretchen here at Valpo, and she asks, if your mind wanders from the spiritual focus as you make art, what do you do? And how does this affect the art?
Yeah, so distractions are everywhere, and the worst distractions are yourself. I have a good friend who studied under the modernist great Philip Guston, and Philip Guston was this chain-smoking abstract expressionist who turned into something quite unique painter. But he told the graduate students one time when I'm painting, there everybody here, people are watching me paint. There's my friend, my next door neighbor, there's my postman, there's Picasso, there's this critic, there's this journalist, and one by one they get bored and they leave. and he said, it's when I leave the real work begins. and I love that because I think it's true. Distractions are everywhere. So, I turn my phone off first of all. I don't have, a channel that's floating about when I'm working. But even finding stillness is very hard today. And it's a real discipline, I think. So one of the ways to look at it is to create that pinhole of discipline, and they, dwell as much as you can in limited time and energy, perhaps, but it doesn't take much. A small desk, a pinhole, and then don't let any concerns when you're creating get in the way. Don't be an editor. Don't be a critic. Don't be a gallerist. Don't be a publisher. Just be yourself, faced with your words or your paint, and one-to-one, be like a child facing the canvas for the first time. Return to your first love and harness that love into what you're making, leaving the distractions hopefully aside. But it is a discipline that you have to learn.
We have a couple more here. Let's see. So one question has to do with brokenness. Miranda says that we are broken in many times in many places. How can we see each new break as a time to be in touch with God instead of a breach of trust that pushes us farther away? And does art, literature, music, etc., play a role in this?
Yeah, I think when you read the Psalms, you realize that the psalmists so honest, and they're angry at God, and they're really um, very vulnerable, and it's the human voice coming out in times of distress. And I think that's often missed in our religion, that God welcomes anger. Jesus welcomed Mary's anger, and he not only understood, but he stood with her in that. And that's when something hit Mary, that he is doing something that is going to cost them, because he's not just exercising his power as Son of God, but he is um, creating a pathway for all of us to be able to find our own resurrection. And that is only done through pain and suffering, through the cross. And so, I think we need to be honest and vulnerable before God. If we are angry, we should be angry. And the Psalms tell us that when we are utterly honest, disgusted with God, we want we want nothing about God's promises. That's when God's promises come to play. That's when God speaks, and these open communiques with the Creator ends up being the sacred text of the Psalms. And so I think there's nothing more important than being honest and being true to the experience, and letting God know, inviting the Spirit to come into that deep pain and suffering that you and I are going through.
Thanks. All right, this question is from Aaron Morrison, and he wants to know what you think the greatest misconceptions about art are. What people get wrong about the nature or work of art.
Yeah, art tends to create misconceptions too, so there's intentionality there. There's something about the ways that we create homogeneous layers of protection around our tribal experiences that causes artists to jump out of that and transgress against that. And so we're kind of inviting misconceptions, by doing that. But we have to remember that border stalkers who meander in the borderlands are the ones that can cross-pollinate and speak, connect with other tribal realities out there. And furthermore, Jesus and the Holy Spirit tends to be in the borderlands. so I tend to experience the Spirit's work in these places where you are misconstrued. There, people misunderstand you. And you feel exiled from your own tribe and whatever the tribe you're wanting to belong to. But I've learned over the years that's a gift, because Jesus himself finds common ground there with our experience of being exiled. And that allows us, I think, to understand the heart of God more. Remember, God that stands outside of existence. So, what we feel comfortable often misplaced, devotions. And so once we begin to adventure outside of our comfort zones, those places where we are misunderstood become a home, and that is something that I found over and over as an artist, and I've learned to, um, it's not easy, but I've learned to enjoy my discoveries there.
Thanks. All right. Another question. I'm curious about this one. There's no name attached to this question, but they ask, what is your favorite piece of artwork you have made? So basically pick your favorite child.
Yeah, so I have this painting when I was 2.5 that my mother kept. I was in Sweden. I was born in Boston, and my father is a research scientist, so he traveled all over, and we were in Sweden. And I painted this image, and it's abstract image, but it uses the same colors and same gestures that I do today. There's no ego in this painting, and I have it framed. My mother kept it and framed it and gave it to me for my college graduation. And I gave it back to her when she went into the nursing home. And then when she passed, I got it back and I reframed it. And I have it in my living room as I'm going out the door to my studio every day. I look at it and I remind myself that's how I need to paint. No ego, freedom, joy, just the sheer sense of adventure, that thrill of my first love, which is painting, and I need to get back there.
Have you ever shared that image anywhere? I'm just curious.
I have on occasion, not really, but I have. It's a little hard to take photos of, but I if I ever have a major retrospective, that would be the first painting.
I have a feeling it's more valuable than whatever is in my baby scrapbook. So. Maybe one more question here. Question is, do you think that certain denominations or religious traditions do art better than others?
Well, the quality of art is so divergent, right? So what I mean is, art is where every denomination has their masterpieces. Art allows somehow for whatever your traditions may be to expand the language of expression that is quite unique to that sect or that kind of culture. But it's also universal, right? So shaker furniture, even though I'm not a shaker and I have very limited understanding of their theology, I can look at the chair and appreciate both the presence of the divine and the craftsmanship of the chair. And by the way, that is true of atheism as well. Atheism is a kind of a denomination that didn't exist before the Reformation. So, so we can also say that atheists can create a masterpiece, actually a devotional masterpiece in negative. So a lot of the films that come out. By the way, everybody do see Minari, which is nominated for Oscars by my friend Lee Isaac Chung, who is a remarkable filmmaker who came out of our system, as it were, of faith communities in Los Angeles. But the films that are out there at Sundance Film Festival, where he got the grand prize and got this film rolling, films done by many non-believers, but just as transcendent in their own way, and valuable. And so Christians ought to be the type of people who can discern and see through expression and see the true masterpiece that is that is behind the work. And that takes a kind of cultivated eye, and ways that our hearts can unlock things, learn to do that in love, rather than in fear of what the work of art might transgress against us. Art is always mediated, so it's safe. It's safe to go into, and there are exceptions, but the most part, it is something that God can use, the Spirit can use, and to sanctify us, sanctify our imagination.
Okay, well, we will wrap up there. I again want
Okay.
to say thank you so much for being with us today.
Absolutely, my delight. I hope to be in person someday.
We would love that very much. We'll work on
Okay.
that. I'll put a plug in again for the book, which you can't really see because the lighting.
Thank you. Yeah.
Art and Faith, really wonderful read. Regardless of your religious tradition, it's a great book for also maybe a penitential season like we're in right now in the
Yes.
Christian tradition. It's one of my favorites of the past couple of years. So real
Thank you.
pleasure to host you. Thank you to everybody who showed up tonight, and thank you for the questions from the audience. And we'll look forward to our next event early April. And until then, take care.
Bye-bye. Thank
Good
you.
night.